Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. First, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. All attendees on the webinar are muted except for the webinar facilitator and our presenters. If at any point during the webinar you have a question, please type it into the chat box on your screen. Please keep your questions short and ideally to no more than 20 to 25 words. These questions will be answered to the extent that time permits during the Q&A portion of the webinar. I will follow up with all webinar attendees after the webinar to share today's slides and the link to SPSSI's YouTube channel where a recording of today's webinar will be posted. Today's webinar, entitled What Challenges and Opportunities Do Psychologists, Policymakers, and Other Immigration Policy Stakeholders Face in Light of Current U.S. Immigration Policies, has been organized by several divisions of the American Psychological Association: Developmental Psychology, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, and the Society for Community Research and Action, in partnership with Fordham Law School's Spherix Center for Social Justice and the APA Immigration Working Group. This webinar is made possible through an APA Public Interest Leadership Conference Health Equity Dissemination Award. I'm Cindy Lucas, Communications Director at the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPSSI, and I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar presenters. Wendy Cervantes, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Law and Social Policy, who will be addressing policy implications for immigrant children and families, challenges and opportunities, and Dr. Luis Zayas, Dean and Robert Lee Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy, the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work, who will speak on the subject, Using Clinical Evaluations to Advocate for Immigrant and Refugee Children. So now I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thanks, Cindy, and thank you for having me today. For those of you who don't know CLASP, we're a national nonpartisan, you can go to my first slide, please. We're a national nonpartisan anti-poverty organization that advocates for federal and state policies that work for low-income communities, including low-income immigrant families. We work on a wide range of policy issues, including childcare and early education, income and work supports, youth policy, job quality, and post-secondary economic success. Next slide, please. So today I've been charged with providing a foundation on the various policies impacting children and immigrant families. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I plan to cover, first, who are the children impacted by U.S. immigration policies. Here I'll provide definitions of the different kids we'll be talking about during today's webinar. Then I'll briefly discuss the intersection of immigration policies and child well-being and how policies have historically overlooked and often harmed children. I'll then move on to the recent immigration executive orders and other policy proposals with a focus on the implications for children. And then I'll wrap up with some challenges and opportunities. And at the very end of the webinar, I'll be happy to address any questions you may have. So you'll want to hold those for the end. Okay, next slide. So first, it's important to note that children and immigrant families now make up 1/4 of all children in the U.S. and comprise the fastest growing segment of our country's increasingly diverse child population. So it's clear that these kids and their healthy development will be critical to our nation's prosperity. Next slide. There are three key categories of children who are impacted by our U.S. immigration policies. The first are children in mixed status families, which I'll be referring to today as children living with at least one unauthorized parent. Currently, more than 5 million children in the U.S. live in mixed status families, 4.1 million of whom are U.S. citizens. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the vast majority of children who live in mixed status families are U.S.-born citizens. This is really important because that means that these children are eligible for the full range of supports available to citizens, and yet they're often less likely to access basic nutrition and health care assistance due to immigration policies that may deter their parents from seeking out such benefits on their behalf. And these are also the kids that are now at greater risk of losing a parent to deportation under the new immigration executive orders. Next slide, please. Next are unauthorized or undocumented children, which are children living in the U.S. without legal authorization, also often referred to as dreamers. It's estimated that there are just under 1 million children under the age of 18 living in the U.S. who are unauthorized. Many of these young people are also current or potential beneficiaries of the 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, which is a program that provides work authorization and temporary reprieve from deportation to certain young people brought to the U.S. as children. As many of you are aware, this program currently faces an uncertain future under the new administration, which is something that I'll cover in more detail later. Next slide, please. Finally, unaccompanied children are children who entered the U.S. alone, who have no lawful immigration status in the U.S., have not attained 18 years of age, and who have no parent or legal guardian in the U.S., or have no parent or legal guardian in the U.S. available to provide care and physical custody. As many of you are aware, more children have been migrating alone in recent years, primarily from the Northern Triangle of Central America, which is made up of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, due to an increase in extreme gang violence and instability in the region, a trend that has grown significantly worse over the past decade, and the violence has increasingly targeted children. Research consistently shows that the majority of these children are valid asylum seekers, many undergoing significant trauma in their home countries as well as on their journey to the U.S. Next slide, please. So just to emphasize this point, this chart shows the significant increase in unaccompanied children over the past few years. Just to provide some context, before fiscal year 2011, the average number of unaccompanied children coming into the U.S. ranged from around 6,000 to 8,000 children per year. In 2012, those numbers started to go up, and in 2014, more than 68,000 unaccompanied children entered the U.S. These numbers dropped slightly in 2015 due to increased enforcement measures taken by the Obama administration to try to curb the flow, including collaboration with the Mexican government to prevent children seeking refuge from entering the U.S. I also want to note that the number of family units entering the U.S. seeking protection, primarily mothers with young children, has also increased significantly with similar trends since 2014. Next slide, please. Okay. Let's delve deeper into the policy context. First, it's important to recognize that immigration policy decisions are often made with little to no regard to children, even though they often face the most significant consequences. Even the policies that are directly related to children often fail to consider their best interests. For example, in recent years, one of the biggest policy debates has been focused on the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. As many of you know, in 2013, the U.S. Senate passed a bipartisan immigration reform bill with a pathway to citizenship, but the House failed to take it up. In 2014, in response to congressional inaction, President Obama introduced executive orders that would have provided temporary relief from deportation and work permits to certain parents of U.S. citizen and lawful permanent resident children, known as the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, or DAPA program. And the orders also would have expanded the 2012 DACA program to make it available to more unauthorized youth. Had these programs been implemented, they were expected to have provided temporary relief to nearly 4 million unauthorized immigrants, including 3.3 million parents of minor children. Unfortunately, as you know, these programs were blocked by a lawsuit from Texas and 25 other states, a case which was considered by the Supreme Court last year and resulted in a tied decision, essentially blocking implementation of the programs. Second, we know that immigration enforcement policies put families at risk of separation. In fact, we saw some of the highest rates of parental deportations during the Obama administration, with on average around 72,000 parents of U.S. citizen children being deported annually between 2011 to 2013. We did start to see a drop in the number of parental deportations starting in 2014, which was largely a result of policies that were adopted throughout the later years in order to mitigate the harm of enforcement on children, which I'll get into more detail later. With regards to unaccompanied children, policies have also fallen short, with unaccompanied children still lacking access to legal representation. We still have kids as young as 4 years old having to face immigration court alone, and they also lack access to federal health care or nutrition assistance. And unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, right after the influx of children in 2014, the response from the federal government was primarily focused on deterrence rather than protection. And then similarly, in an effort to deter families from migrating to the U.S., the Obama administration also significantly expanded the controversial use of family detention, essentially jailing mothers and children, the majority of whom are asylum seekers, upon their arrival to the United States. And finally, children and immigrant families, including those that are lawfully present, and sorry, my picture is blocking the text there, but just that's what that's supposed to say, is that children and immigrant families, including those that are lawfully present or those that are U.S. citizens, they've long been impacted by confusing and complicated immigrant eligibility rules that create additional barriers to public benefits and income supports. Next slide, please. Furthermore, a growing body of research shows that a child's healthy development is harmed by harsh anti-immigrant policies that exacerbate the stress that mixed status families already experience. This diagram captures that impact. The research tells us that the stress and fear related to unauthorized status, whether it be the status of a child, youth, or parent, combined with less family income due to a parent's limited employment options due to their unauthorized status, as well as the impact of a parent's deportation on family income, combined with limited access to education and safety net programs, all lead to long-term harms to a child's overall development. We also know that the impact to kids is greatest when there are particularly harsh enforcement policies in place, like the ones we're now seeing at a national scale. Next slide, please. Okay, so turning to the current policy context. In January, President Trump issued a series of executive orders on immigration and refugee policy. A few of these orders have been successfully challenged in the courts, but some have already been implemented, and others, like building a wall and tripling the number of ICE agents or immigration enforcement agents, are in need of appropriations from Congress. For the purpose of today's presentation, I'll be focusing on the orders specific to immigration enforcement. One order was focused on enforcement along the Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements Order, and the other, enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States, was focused on enforcement in the interior. And I just have to say, while advocates really, braced ourselves for the worst with the incoming administration, no one was really quite prepared for the magnitude of the orders that were issued, and these orders have already created tremendous chaos for immigrant families and those who serve them. Next slide, please. So, how do the new immigration orders specifically impact children? I'm going to provide a brief overview, but I do want to flag that I've also provided links to a fact sheet that CLASP released in April, which covers this topic in more detail. So first, the new orders now make every unauthorized immigrant a priority for deportation, including parents and legal guardians of U.S. citizen children. We've now seen many immigrants, including parents, who previously would not have been considered priorities, now being deported. In particular, we've seen an increase in cases of immigrants showing up to their regular check-ins with ICE only to then be detained and deported. Second, the order also massively increases enforcement, including the hiring of 3 times the enforcement agents in the interior of the U.S., along with an increase in the number of Border Patrol agents along the southern border. The order also speeds up the deportation process for certain immigrants, including those that have existing deportation orders and those who have resided in the U.S. for less than 2 years. The orders also call for increased involvement of local police to act as immigration agents, which we know from existing research can significantly limit immigrants' mobility and create distrust of police and inhibit children's access to basic things like health care. The order also calls for massive expansion of immigrant detention, including family detention. And finally, the border enforcement order weakens protections for unaccompanied children traveling to the U.S. alone by significantly limiting which children qualify for unaccompanied status and also subjecting their parents to possible criminal charges for facilitating their child's migration. And finally, it's also worth noting that the President's recent 2018 budget request also supports this enforcement-heavy strategy, calling for $1.5 billion for increased enforcement capacity. Next slide, please. I actually won't spend, next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on this, as I know Dr. Zayas will discuss this further, but I just want to flag that the research does consistently demonstrate that the loss of a parent to deportation or detention has a detrimental impact on children's mental and physical health, their economic security, and their overall well-being. Next slide. So it's also important to note that even with these executive orders, there are still some existing ICE protections for children, and so I want to point them out, even though we know that many of these are still subject to change at any time. The first is prosecutorial discretion, which has been used in the past to provide discretion to ICE, to allow ICE agents discretion in making decisions whether or not to deport an individual. So for instance, this has been used in the past when an ICE agent has when ICE has made a decision not to deport a parent whose only violation was being in the U.S. without papers. So while prosecutorial discretion is still available, it should be noted that it's been significantly narrowed under the new orders, but does still exist. Another important policy that's still in place is the sensitive locations policy, which actually restricts ICE activities, ICE enforcement activities in designated quote-unquote sensitive locations, which include places like preschools, primary schools, child care and early education programs, bus stops, post-secondary institutions, hospitals, health clinics, places of worship, religious ceremonies, and public demonstrations. And finally, the 2013 ICE Parental Interest Directive is an ICE policy that helps ensure parents can make decisions regarding their child's care throughout the removal process and helps facilitate their communication with the child welfare system if needed. This was a policy that was introduced in 2013 in response to outcry from advocates related to the numbers of U.S. parents of U.S. citizens being deported and also the implications for the child welfare system. And so this policy was really aimed at preventing unnecessary separation of families and child welfare system involvement. And while it has been revised slightly, it is still in existence. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on from enforcement to the DACA program. Many of you are familiar with this program, which provides eligible youth with 2 years of renewable work authorization and a reprieve from deportation. The overview of the requirements for the program are here. These are young people who have been vetted by the federal government and have willingly offered their information to immigration authorities. And during the campaign, and even in his first few days in office, President Trump has suggested that he may repeal the program, possibly replacing it with something else. It's really hard to know what may happen. Next slide. Currently, more than 760,000 young people have obtained DACA since the program's inception. Obviously, a repeal of DACA would have a devastating impact on beneficiaries. The program has changed their lives and also the lives of their families. Several studies reveal that DACA has helped young people better pursue their higher education and career goals, and even do basic things we take for granted, like get a driver's license. For example, a recent study revealed that more than 67% of DACA youth are currently employed, with more than 63% moving to a better paying job and 6% starting their own business. More than 1 in 5 DACA beneficiaries have purchased their first car, and more than 10% reported purchasing their first home. And in fact, many DACA youth have become the primary breadwinners for their families and have purchased sometimes the first home that a family has ever had. Next slide. Unfortunately, as mentioned, well, actually, fortunately, the administration has currently left the program in place, but the looming threat of the program's possible cancellation has obviously caused serious alarm among beneficiaries and their families, as well as their supporters. Legal service providers have been advising youth not to apply if they haven't already, while those who have DACA have been anxiously awaiting their renewals. And while DACA beneficiaries are supposed to be safe from Trump's new deportation policies and are actually specifically exempted within the executive orders, we've already seen several DACA beneficiaries detained by ICE over the past several weeks, and in April, a lawsuit was filed against the federal government in response to the deportation of a DACA recipient who was deported to Mexico after being detained by border agents. I also want to emphasize once again the mental health impact of this looming uncertainty. In fact, shortly following the election, immigrant youth groups reported several suicides in their community as young people struggled with the idea of having their benefits suddenly taken away from them. And a big part of the response following the election has and continues to be connecting immigrants and their families to mental health resources. I also want to flag that DACA youth are also carrying the additional burden now of becoming potential caregivers for their younger siblings in the case of their parents' possible deportation. Next slide. And finally, I want to touch on some of the threats to basic needs and education we've seen as a result of the immigration executive orders and ramped up enforcement around the country. Much of these threats are based on the climate of fear that these orders have created. For example, last month, CLASP started a round of interviews with service providers, many of whom were child care and early education providers. And even in Greensboro, North Carolina, the town that we started doing these initial interviews in, which is a place that's very friendly to immigrants, it was clear that immigrant families were attempting to limit how much they left their house, carefully planning even visits to the grocery, and avoiding interactions with any agency, not even just government agencies, that would require them to provide any personal information for fear that their information could get into the hands of ICE and potentially lead to deportation. Many service providers also reported that parents are afraid of ICE even just showing up to the community-based organization, health clinic, or child care program where they might be present at, making them fearful of even seeking out these benefits or, attending a meeting at a community-based organization. Likewise, then, the new orders have obviously created real concerns for health and human service providers, and they're now asking questions like, will ICE show up at their door, or will they be asked to share information about their clients? And agencies also want to know what state and federal privacy protections are still in place to protect their clients' information. Finally, as many of you are probably aware, a leaked draft executive order was circulated by media in January, which is now being referred to as the Public Charge Executive Order. If signed in its draft form, the order would drastically revise several policies related to immigrants' ability to access public benefits, including the ability of immigrants to enter or stay in the U.S. through the family-based immigration system. I want to emphasize that this leaked order has not been released, and even if it is eventually released and signed, there will be limits based on existing statutes which only Congress can change, and there would need to be a formal regulatory process before many of the provisions could be implemented. For those who are interested in learning more about this particular order, leaked order, I've also provided a link to a commentary we issued earlier this year later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Finally, since a big concern has been whether or how states and localities may be coerced into sharing information about immigrant clients or their participation in various programs, it's important to note that there are several civil rights and privacy protections that remain in place that can help protect immigrant families and their information. And so we are urging program administrators to check to make sure that their enrollment practices and privacy policies are in line with federal requirements. And here's a list of some of the key civil rights and privacy protections that remain in place. I won't go through the entire list in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have later on. Next slide. So looking ahead, what are the policy challenges and opportunities? Well, as I've mentioned, we know that there will continue to be a lot of uncertainty regarding future executive orders. Will there be more? How far will they go on enforcement? There's also the confusion and fear among immigrant communities and service providers will continue to be an ongoing challenge, and the need for clear, accurate information is very urgent. It's also important for us to pay attention to what's happening at the state policy level, as we've already seen a range of proposals both on the pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant side. Everything from sanctuary city laws to show me your papers laws, one of the most extreme that we've just seen happen recently in Texas, SB4, which perhaps Dr. Zayas will speak to more. And so, there's just a range of state policy issues that are also at play here. We also know that federal and state budget deliberations will play a big role. At the federal level, for example, it will largely determine how much more enforcement capacity is funded. And cuts to safety net programs at the federal level will have a significant impact on state budgets, forcing them to make cuts that could impact the low-income communities broadly, including, obviously, an impact for immigrant families. In terms of opportunities, we also expect ongoing legal challenges to executive orders to continue to happen. I'm sure many of you heard about the success of the Muslim ban challenge, which is now going to the Supreme Court. And also we will continue to see federal legislation on both sides, both those that are pushing this anti-immigrant enforcement agenda, as well as those that are aiming to push back on some of these administrative proposals. Next slide. So in fact, here are some of the relevant federal bills that have already been introduced or are pending. The first is the Bridge Act, the bar removal of individuals who dream and grow our economy. This is a bipartisan bill that was introduced in both the House and Senate late last year after the initial threats to the DACA program were first out there, and then early again this year it was introduced, and this is basically legislation that would provide a temporary solution for DACA beneficiaries in the case that the DACA program should be repealed. Also, the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act is another bill that's been previously introduced, that was introduced in the House in April. This would provide government-funded legal representation for unaccompanied children. The DREAM Act of 2017, which is a bill that would provide a pathway to citizenship for DACA beneficiaries and other Dreamer youth, is currently pending and is expected to be introduced this summer. And we also expect a few other bills, the Protecting Family Values at the Border Act, which would protect families that may be at risk of separation upon apprehension by Customs and Border Patrol, as well as the Help Separated Children and Help Separated Families Act, which are two bills that are aimed at mitigating the harm to children that are impacted by immigration enforcement. Next slide. All right, so how can you help? Well, policymakers and advocates continuously need research and data that can help make the case for how anti-immigrant policies impact short and long-term child well-being outcomes, and how that impacts not only immigrant communities, but all communities in the United States. We also are constantly in need of stories of impacted children and families, and I know Dr. Zayas will get into this into more detail, but it's incredibly helpful to have expert testimony from folks in the mental health field, social workers, researchers, all have a really powerful voice and perspective to share. And then, the community is particularly in need of resources and tools on how to help immigrant families prepare and cope with the increased stress and threats that are related to deportation in this enforcement-heavy environment. Next slide. And these are just some links to some of the CLASP resources that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. This is the cover for the brief that we released on how Trump's immigration orders harm children, and then the link to the commentary I mentioned on the public charge executive order for folks who want to learn more about that. And then next slide. And then these are also just some additional resources that the first two from the Women's Refugee Commission and Appleseed, which are resources on how to help families plan for potential deportation, and then some resources relevant to some of the policies that I mentioned during today's webinar. And with that, I will here's my contact information, and I am more than happy to answer any questions that you might have in the future if something comes up after this webinar. And once again, I just want to thank the APA for having me today, and I will turn it back over to Cindy or Dr. Zayas.
Good afternoon. This is Luis Zayas speaking. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. And Wendy Cervantes did a great job in laying out some of the policy issues, many of the policy issues under which many of us who practice psychology or mental health, any mental health practice, have to deal with. And what I'd like to do today is talk about the mental health impact on children. That is the mental health impact of the environment in which we are now facing. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is talk briefly about the aggressive immigration enforcement, and then talk specifically first about citizen children. Those are the ones that Wendy mentioned are in mixed status families, and what happens when their parents get deported. I'll move on to refugee children who are currently in immigration detention. Not all of you will be working necessarily with children in the detention centers, but you may be working with children post-detention, but it's worth knowing what they go through. And then at the end, I'll close out with some ideas about how we go about doing evaluations, what are the best approaches, and the kind of advocacy that we can undertake. My talk is really based on my clinical experience evaluating children of undocumented immigrants and children in detention centers since, well, over a decade now. And it's also based on some of the research that I have done and the research of others. Next slide, please. Thank you. You all are aware of the very aggressive immigration enforcement that's going on. Wendy mentioned some of the things that are happening. It's not just the parents of citizen children, but the way we're handling unaccompanied minors and mothers and children who have entered the U.S. fleeing the violence and the poverty of Central America. And we have seen it on television. We've seen it everywhere. And of course, we're not the only ones to see it. Next slide, please. We have seen the effect on school children. These are documents, if you will, from children that were published in the Huffington Post in February, shortly after the inauguration of our president. And these children were responding to the threats that were being made on television and they were hearing about. And you can see here that children are saying in Spanish and English, yo tengo miedo que se lleven a mi papá y mi mamá. That I'm afraid that they will take my mother and my father. I hate you, Donald Trump, as that child spelled it. And another child says, we don't have to make fun of people's skin because we are still people. And children are talking about being scared. Many teachers have reported children coming in, crying and upset and worried about their parents. And that in this on the right, the child says, I'm angry and sad because I think I'm going to Mexico. I don't speak Spanish. I know English. I'm from Austin, Texas. And this is the kind of situation that many citizen children experience. They are, after all, U.S. citizens. They were born here. Seldom have they ever traveled to their parents' country of origin. This is their country, and I think that's what's important to emphasize here, that citizen children aren't going back somewhere. This is their country. They're going to a place that their parents know, but they don't know. And this child saying, I don't speak Spanish, I only know English, is very appropriate because many of the children are actually English dominant and they may speak Spanish at home, but it's Spanish that is limited to whatever vocabulary level their parents have learned. And so these children are English speakers, native English speakers rather than Spanish speakers. And you'll see the frustration in them when they have to when they have to go to a place that is really not theirs. Next slide. So the two groups of children I'll talk about in some depth now are the citizen children. Those are the children of undocumented parents, one parent or both parents, and these are what Wendy mentioned as mixed status families. So these children will be in any assortment. They'll be the older children may be undocumented, the younger siblings may be citizens, one parent may be a citizen, the other one might not, or both parents might not. So it really is mixed statuses, and it's not just one way, but different configurations of families. The other group of children I want to talk about are the refugee children. They're survival immigrants. They're fleeing circumstances in Central America that are life-threatening, and they would rather take the chance of dying en route to safety than to dying at home at the hands of the gangs and the police and the sort of state, if not sponsored, state acquiesced violence. And these are the kids and their mothers that I have seen. As you'll note here, I'm not including unaccompanied minors. It's not a group that I've done any work with, but they are an important group also to consider as we talk. Go ahead, next slide, please. So going back to the citizen children, I have a book out, Forgotten Citizen, which is about the citizen child and the things that they undergo, the kind of mental health issues, the experience that they live. And again, these are DACA eligible, even DACA ineligible kids. So they live in mixed status families. But with the citizen children, they are U.S. citizens. However, the law limits the exercise of their citizenship rights. So for example, a minor cannot appeal to have his parents, undocumented parents, stay in the U.S. So that abrogates their rights as citizens. In immigration courts, we do not observe, as we do in family court, the best interest of the child doctrine. That's standard in family court, but in immigration court, the child is not considered a factor. The judge does not have to take into consideration the best interest of the child, but rather what they must do to deport or as it's called, remove the parents from the United States. Next slide, please. So what happens to the citizen children who live here with undocumented parents? There's plenty of research out there, not as much as we would like, but we have seen that the average citizen child, like those drawings or statements that the children made. Next slide, please, there. These children have to live, they have to hide in open spaces. They're constantly worried about what will happen to their parents. Consequently, it requires a lot of hypervigilance. They're constant. Hello? I'm having trouble here with the PowerPoint. Next slide. There. These children must be hypervigilant at all times. They have to be able to watch out for any indication that their parents are under some threat of apprehension by law enforcement or ICE. There's also always this anticipation of fear of ICE arrests. The constant dread in their lives is that the parents will be arrested, detained, and deported, leaving the child bereft of parents. We have seen that in this heightened immigration enforcement culture that we're living and we lived through in the Obama administration, that parents begin to take their children for healthcare visits less frequently for fear of disclosure. Now, when a child is very sick, they will take the child to the pediatrician, but in some cases they might defer pediatric care, well baby visits, because of the fear of disclosure. And certainly with the emphasis now on apprehending anybody who is undocumented, that fear is heightened. We do know that many citizen children of undocumented immigrants undergo or experience economic hardship. Their parents have to change jobs frequently. They may not bring enough. Sometimes they are the victims of unscrupulous employers who will make them work all week but not pay them or not pay them enough, and they have no recourse. There are some small agencies in most cities that will try to fight for them, but they don't have any rights. The other thing we've seen is housing instability. Parents have to move homes, move their families to wherever the jobs are. And this is not like the migrant farm workers. These are people within a community, a city, where they have to be able to move to other parts of the city in order to be able to continue to work. The parents of citizen children, undocumented parents, are less likely to seek child care, food stamps, despite the fact that their children may be eligible for them because they are U.S. citizens. And we do know that when a parent is anxious, that anxiety gets transmitted to the child. And that the child is always, again, back to the top bullet there, they're hypervigilant about what's happening to mommy, what's happening to daddy. I hear them talking in whispered tones in the other room. I wonder what's going on. Or they may see mom crying or dad really upset, that then make the child more anxious about the possibility of losing a parent. Next slide, please. In our research, we have found that children in mixed status families, citizen children, have to follow this cultural script of silence, okay? And because they have to interpret and manage everyday life. They have to worry about what they can say, when they can say, and who they can hang out with and talk to openly and who they cannot. They're governed by these rules and responsibilities that we saw in the research we conducted with U.S. citizen children of undocumented Mexican families, that they live under two rules, many more than these, but one is parents will tell them, don't talk. Basically, be silent. Don't let anybody know who we are or that we're undocumented. So the child is constantly told, don't talk. The other one is sit still and behave. It's a second rule. These children must exhibit extraordinary self-restraint and discipline because they do not want to draw attention to themselves and their parents when their parents are undocumented. So a tantrum in Walmart is not likely with a citizen child of an undocumented parents because the parents say that's where we could get in trouble. We had stories told of children who were riding with their parents in the car, and as soon as a police car pulled alongside it to say a stoplight, everybody sat still. They simply froze in place and had to sit still, whether their parents told them or the children knew. That's the kind of fear that they are constantly under. They feel a sense that they must protect their parents, something that we think is a responsibility that is too great for a child to take on. They should not be responsible for taking care of their parents and protecting their parents, but in fact, that is what they must do. And one of the things that comes out may come out is a sense of guilt if they do something wrong or they fail to follow an order, that their parents might be arrested. Children that we heard from sometimes made connections of their parents' arrest and detention for something that had nothing to do with it, but had to do with the child's behavior. Well, if I had eaten my broccoli last night, mommy and daddy would not have been arrested today. Those kinds of cause and effect connections that a younger child is subject to experiencing. And then there's the shame, because if something does happen, guilt is I did something wrong, where shame is I am bad, I am wrong. And that could also be much more toxic for a child than just simply having a sense of guilt. And of course, we know that with this kind of stress and the impact on the neurobiological processes, on hormones and things, the allostatic impact on these children, that their developmental trajectories are affected. Next slide, please. Again, what we have seen with the studies that we have read and the ones that we have conducted is anxiety and depression, again, the worry and the hypervigilance. Children report difficulty communication with friends, the loss of supportive networks in their neighborhoods. They fear violence if they were to be returned or if they were to return to their parents' country. And sometimes the negative perceptions of their parents' home country, because it's always cast out to be as a bad place to go. We saw children experiencing separation anxiety. They isolated themselves and became withdrawn. They were constantly worried about their parents not returning. We saw aggression, kids lashing out with others, and of course the self-stigma, the self-perception of themselves as bad. If my parents are undocumented, that means we must be bad people. And again, we've seen behavioral problems. We saw in our study high attentional problems, ADHD scores on the child behavior checklist that was related to the constant anxiety of the parents' detention and deportation. So it wasn't ADHD in its kind of more clinical basic form, but a reactive attentional problem. And we also saw we have seen clinical levels of other behavioral disorders among these children because of the stress on them. Next slide, please. And remember, we talked about transmitting the anxiety from parent to child. Well, the parents, are always fearing the arrest, detention, and deportation. We have talked to them, and this is something that we need to think about moving forward, is having safety plans in place for the citizen child. What happens if mommy or daddy is arrested? We have suggested to parents to have an envelope with some money and some telephone numbers under the cookie jar and telling their children, if we don't arrive, open up that envelope, you'll find the telephone number to your aunt's house or the neighbor's house. This is the money so you can buy your brother or your sister something to eat. And so safety planning. We talk about guardianship arrangements. Fortunately, as citizen children, these children can, power of attorney in the custody of the child can be arranged. And so we need to talk to parents about those. And when we talk about guardianship, we have to think about the legal status of the person who would take custody of the child, because it doesn't help to have them go into the hands of another undocumented family where the same thing could occur again and traumatize the child twice. The parents have to make this difficult decision. Do we take our children upon deportation, or do we leave the children behind? We call the taking the children to other countries the exiles, because they did not choose to move there. They were forced by government action to go with their parents, and it essentially comes to exile. And then, of course, parents could leave children behind, those we call the orphans, and neither of those is a choice that any parent should ever have to make. But they do. Next slide, please. Now let me turn to the children who are in detention. These are the refugee children. Again, you may not be evaluating them in the detention centers as I have, but you will see them once their asylum hearing has been, their asylum request has been processed and they've been released into our communities and have to return to court when the time comes for the final hearing. And we have to think about the fact that these children in detention have undergone 3 levels of trauma, what I call trauma upon trauma upon trauma. First is the pre-migration trauma. That's what's happening to them in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, where the gang violence and domestic violence oftentimes intermix, because sometimes a father may be an alcoholic member of the gang. There's that sort of trauma. And think about it not just as one discrete trauma, but as an environment of violence in which they may not see the violence, but they may see the results, the dead bodies on the street, the gunshots, the hanging body, someone hung over an overpass to send silence and fear to the community. Those parents flee that. These children are brought with their parents to that. Then there's the in-transit trauma, when they cross the border of Guatemala into Mexico and they traverse the 1,000 more miles to the U.S. border, they must hire coyotes. They are subject to assault and deprivation. We have heard of the worst sorts of assaults, of rapes of mothers and daughters, of abductions and being held in dungeons, basically what they describe as dungeons, but old warehouses, and sometimes in caves until some ransom is paid by the family that's either in the U.S. or the sending country. And there's an awful lot of deprivation of food and water and things like that. But we have to think about what these children see. They see cadavers, they see the violence, they see the fear in everybody's eyes, and that there might be a complicity of the police with the coyotes and the gang members, as well as the local vendors. You don't really know who to trust. They arrive then on our border, and there they are arrested. And that's what I call the post-migration trauma. And it begins with their detention and placement in hieleras, the so-called ice boxes, and in the detention centers. Go to the next slide, please. This is what a hielera looks like. It's a small room, about 30 people in them. People are kept there for about 48 hours. The fluorescent lights are on for the full 48 hours, are constantly on. And they don't get released from there. And as you'll see in the background there's a half wall. On the other side of that is a toilet. And that's all they have. You cannot wash your face, and you must do your toilet, your business in the presence of so many other people. Just recently I heard of one young girl who slept by the toilet because the water warmed up the bowl, and by sleeping close to the toilet bowl, she felt more comfortable. But that's the first experience in our country, and that is a horrible thing to experience. Next slide, please. From the hielera, they might be moved in Texas to one of 2 detention centers. One in Karnes City, Texas, that that holds 500 or so more mothers and children. It's run by the GEO Group, a private prison corporation, and it's a former county prison that housed men. And you can see it has courtyards. These children are kept in there. Right now, they're about 20 for about 20 days with their mothers, and then they're either released or deported. And they do not see anything for the entire time they're there. You can see in the far wall there on the bottom left, a wall that's easily 20 feet high and barbed wire. And so the children, while they're there and their mothers, do not see the outside. Next slide, please. The other detention center here is in Dilley, Texas, which is a larger group run by what used to be called known as the Corrections Corporation of America. They have another name now, Civic Corps or something like that. And this houses 2,500 mothers and children, and it's more campus-like, but it's really, it looks more like the old internment camps, Manzanara, from the internment camps of 1940s, in which we put Japanese American citizens. And that's the other one. And again, the children are kept there. They have no interaction with the local community. In fact, these two places are located in remote areas where it's hard for lawyers and families to visit. Next slide, please. When we have mothers in prison, the children experience deprivation and fear. They're often confused. In the kids I talk to, we're not criminals, they say. We came here looking for safety. We saw, especially among the adolescents, depression, increased levels, higher levels of depression than we would find in any community population. And among the younger groups, especially among the younger children, these disrupted attachments and in the insecure bonds of infants, because we have mothers there with newborns, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, very young children, and the attachment bonds that are forming in those first 24 months are disrupted because the parents do not have any power. They're disempowered, the mothers. We saw in the mother a great deal of mental health problems. We saw recently, as recently as a week ago, a woman attempted suicide, a woman from Afghanistan. Last year, I evaluated a woman who had attempted suicide, and she was from Honduras, attempted suicide. And we see the rampant depression among the mothers, and they're trying to cope as best as they can. We see the parenting that's interrupted because the parents can no longer be in charge of their children's lives. They can't monitor their children because that's all done by the guards. And of course, that changes the family dynamics, as we can imagine. Children don't know, should I listen to my mother or should I listen to the guard? My mother doesn't cook for us, you know, she can't do anything. She shares a room, we share a room with another family. So all of the family dynamics a normal family would experience are disrupted. Next slide, please. I point you to this, the recent policy statement by the American Academy of Pediatrics and Detention of Immigrant Children. You can find it easily on Google and get the PDF, but it really gives you a great deal of background, research background, and arguments as to why children should not be detained. And it's a much deeper examination of this issue than I've been able to do today. Next slide, please. So let's talk about evaluating citizen children. Now, we're talking about the citizen children. Remember, these are the children who are U.S. citizens but of undocumented immigrants. So what will happen is that the parent will have a removal, an order of removal or a deportation order. And we may be called by an attorney, an immigration attorney, defending, representing the parent who's being detained or deported. We may be called about representing or conducting an evaluation that will help them, the attorney, in fighting for the cancellation of the removal and having the family stay in the country. And so, of course, there's, we go through the standard parts of the interview, the appointment and the interview, making sure that you know exactly what it is that the attorney wants to do in his or her case for the family. It's not a generic psychological evaluation. It's a very specific one. It's a very specific evaluation. Pardon me, my computer is shut down for some reason or other here. But I'll continue. So we have to get the background, the family and developmental history, pediatric records and school records, because those are available. Remember, these are citizen children, and therefore we know we can get that information. It's different when we have children in detention where they have no records. And the question here is, remember, it was the best interest of the child is what happens in family court, but in this case, we are talking about will the child experience exceptional and extremely unusual hardship if their parent was to be deported? And that's what we have to show in our evaluation. When we're evaluating children in detention or post-detention, I can tell you this: many of the measures that we have are not very effective at all. The measures don't really capture the high levels of trauma. I'm sorry, go to the next slide, children in detention. Many of the measures we have don't capture the full reaction to immigration and refugee and fleeing the country. But we have to use what we can. I found recently the Hispanic Stress Inventory second edition has items on migration experiences which could be used within a clinical interview without using standard measures. The other, so we have to assess trauma, and we have to segregate the pre, peri, and post-migration experiences. Again, the post-migration are those hieleras and detention. In the cases of children in detention, the emphasis is on what's happening to them in detention. We cannot talk a great deal about the past, but it's about what the present detention is doing to them. And once they're out into the community, then we can go into the pre and the in transit and the post-migration experiences. Next slide, please. Now, in this case here, this is just it came out of one of my evaluations, and here's where I was trying to show exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. This is the case of a child whose father was being deported to Honduras, and this little girl, we call her Amy. This is the summary. Now, I've gone through the evaluation and presented all the facts, and I write, her anxiety can, in the long run, have detrimental effects. In the next few years, she will be entering middle school, puberty, and full adolescence. Neither being left in the U.S. in the care of her mother alone or a family or foster care, nor moving to Honduras with her parents will resolve the challenges that will face Amy. If she remains in the U.S. without her parents, that is, she will be deprived of a stable source of affection and emotional attachment. If she were to move to Honduras with her family, the risk rises considerably. And so I end with a disruption in the family stability, especially under duress of a father's deportation, can have untold negative consequences on her. Her psychological and social advancement would be derailed, possibly irreparably damaged. So we won this case, but that's the kind of language. I do not use, and you should not use, exceptional and extremely unusual hardship in anything you write, because then they're saying you're using legalese for a psychological exam, but you're trying to show it demonstrate that it would have exceptional and extremely unusual detrimental effects on the child. Next slide, please. In the case of a child that was in detention, this was a 7-year-old boy and his parents, his mother and older brother, who had witnessed the dead body of his uncle, who had been shot by gang members in the living room of a family member's home. I presented all of that and what was happening to them in detention. So I summarized that this family, who has not only suffered considerable past trauma, but is also in danger of further deterioration, is detained. So I was talking about the present detention. They have witnessed serious and brutal violence. That's not good for them. The detention is complicating the psychological trauma they saw. Worse still is the harm that could come to them physically, perhaps mortally and psychologically, if they are to be returned to Honduras. And so in my considered opinion, Petra, the mother, pseudonym, and her two children and her two sons should be released to make a new life for themselves in the United States. And again, it was demonstrating what would happen to them and how the trauma from the past and the trauma of detention would impact them. Next. So when we go to court, I think, we probably, if you've ever presented in court or testified in court, you rehearse your questions with the attorneys. You go through the process of presenting the child or the children by, age and development and so on. You can be sure that the government attorney will question your credibility, but you're not on trial. You have to remember that. They can never challenge you on your mental health expertise. They can only challenge you on things like how often are you testifying in court, how much money are you making on this testimony, on testifying in court, basically to try to undermine your credibility by showing you to be a promiscuous testifier, expert witness, that you'll do anything for anybody. And it's important that you speak with confidence, clarity, avoid jargon, because you have to take an educational stance. You're educating the court, which is the judge and the government attorney, about the impact on the child and the family that you're representing. Next slide, please. I say to you that there are steps. If we are moving from the clinical to the advocacy, it helped me that I thought of one case of building a cause. Again, Wendy went over this, but writing your op-eds, using the press to inform the public, use social media, and again, partnering with teams of advocates in class action lawsuits, testifying in court, and in your local legislatures. Next slide, please. And I'll stop there, and I hope that's been helpful, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis and Wendy. We all enjoyed your presentation very much. This is Serena Davila, and I'm with the American Psychological Association, and I want to thank all of you for calling in today, and we hope you enjoyed it. So this is the last portion of the webinar. We still have 15 minutes left, so if you do have any questions, we only have 2 right now, so we're happy to take more if you want to type it in your question box. So the first one is actually not a question from Leslie Orloff. It's actually just a commentary. So she just wanted folks to know that NIWAP has a new publication that may be useful in providing information for courts and others about the effect of having experienced trauma on children, particularly with regard to brain development. And we'll send that link at the end when we send you other information. So we hope that that's helpful to you. Okay, so our first question, and perhaps we'll get others, comes from the line of Tori Johnson. And they thank you for the presentation, Wendy and Luis. And Tori asks, are there estimates of the number of children whose parents have been deported? If not, what are the issues with the numbers that do exist?
Hi, I can take that question. They're actually the security is required to track the number of parents of U.S. citizen children that are removed on an annual basis, and we have numbers up through I believe 2016. We have not seen numbers yet for 2017. I think I actually might have them right here. So we know that, for example, as I had mentioned earlier, we did see, some of the most record levels of parents being deported during the Obama administration, and then saw some of those numbers start to go down as a result of some, policies that were put in place to kind of mitigate, to prevent that from happening, and having prosecutorial discretion used more often. But just to, for example, those reports from DHS show that, for example, in 2012, there were 83,000 parents of U.S. citizen children deported. In 2013, it was 72,410. 2014 was 39,300. 2015, 1,411. And the numbers for, I don't have the full numbers for 2016 in front of me right now, but these are all numbers that if you get in touch with me, I can try to get you some of the links, but you can find them on the DHS website as well.
Thank you, Wendy.
The one thing I would flag, though, is that, of course, there are some, these are, of course, parents who have offered up this information, so not all parents may reveal to ICE that they have children upon deportation. So that is one thing to flag in terms of, how much these reflect the number of parents removed.
Let me just add, I'm glad we have some numbers, Wendy. Thank you so much. The demographers a few years ago crunched some numbers and estimated that for every 2 adult undocumented immigrants that are deported, 1 U.S. citizen child is affected. Now, affected could mean that they're left behind, they go to the other country, but in some way impacted by deportation. So if you think of the numbers that Wendy just read out, if you do the math, it's 2 to 1 ratio, two adults to 1 child. You can see that the numbers are in the tens of thousands of children who are affected by the parents' deportation. Doesn't mean that they've gone into exile. They might have been left as orphans, or their parents have fled if they were released.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question comes from Olga Lucia Herrera. She asks, do you do trainings in any other cities, for example, in the Northwest, or do you do trainings?
Who's the question for?
For either one of you. Do you do trainings in other cities, for example, in the Northwest?
Only when invited. But right now don't have, we're not on the road.
Okay, there you go.
We have been trying to fill as many TA requests depending on, from various program administrators and service providers and educators on some of the policies that are impacting their clientele, as well as strategies for how they can address the concerns and help families prepare. So we are available, and we also work closely with the National Immigration Law Center on providing these types of training. So yes, please feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Jacqueline Evans. How often are the children able to converse in English, and how does this lack of proficiency impact their legal representation and their psychological evaluation?
I guess that might be for me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the question is, language is less of a, when we're working with citizen children, they tend to be English speaking, though they speak Spanish at home. They are, of course, most of them will be of school age, and so they tend to speak English, and we can use English instruments in English. Their parents typically, if they're filling out, say, a parental form of a measure, those have to be in Spanish. So it does behoove the evaluator to be able to speak in both languages, or work with another mental health associate who can interview, say, the parent in Spanish and the child in English. In the detention centers and those who are recent refugees, it's almost entirely Spanish, as these children have grown up in their countries of origin.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Sandra Gutierrez. Do you have a sense of how many schools and early learning centers have trauma-informed care in place?
Go ahead, Luis, if you want to take that.
No, I can't answer. I don't have the statistics in any way.
Yeah, I don't have the statistics either. I do know that that is a question. We're getting a lot of requests from early education providers and child care providers on how to provide trauma-informed care, specifically to this population, and given the the increased anxiety and stress. And we certainly refer you to some resources. Once again, there's my email on some trauma, and I actually know the American Psychological Association also has some great resources on how to provide that type of
Sure, yeah, we can, if you need anything further, Sandra, feel free to, my email isn't up there, but my email is SDAV as in Victor, ILA, Serena Davila, @apa.org. Okay, and our next question, and we have about 5 minutes left. Our next question comes from Emma Flanagan. I've heard the post-traumatic stress disorder does not represent itself to a greater number of refugee children and parents, but it does present itself to a greater extent in refugee children and parents. Does your research dive into this kind of data?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand it.
Sure. So I think she's asking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and she wants to know if, she says, I have heard that post-traumatic stress disorder does not represent itself to a greater number of refugee children and parents, but it does present itself to a greater extent in refugee children. So she's saying post-traumatic stress disorder, she's heard that it's shown to a greater extent in refugee children and parents. Do you have any data on this?
No, I'm afraid I don't. But one of the things we have found is that during the time, especially with kids in detention and recent immigration, they're often so focused on survival that it's almost as though those symptoms don't emerge. It's when they enter the community and life becomes stable that we begin to see the emergence of behavioral disorders that didn't happen before, because now the trauma is emerging, is no longer sealed over by having been kind of in the process of survival and coping.
And Emma, this is Serena from the APA. You can also email me about that as well. I think one of the fact sheets that we put together may have some more information on that. So if that's not enough for you, again, my email is sdav as in Victor, ILA@apa.org. Okay. Our next question, I think we have time for just one or two more, comes from Joelle Tacknett. Forgive me if I mispronounced your name. She thanks you both for the wonderful presentation, and she says, I am wondering if either of you could speak to the role of psychologists and other mental health professionals in working with families regarding these issues of chronic stress. For example, hypervigilance regarding deportation. Are there active interventions out there to help families cope with this? Okay, so I can almost take that, and perhaps Luis wants to chime in. That's exactly what we're working on, Joelle. I'm in government relations at APA, and there can be sometimes a disconnect between the federal level, right, which is what where Wendy and I work mainly in lobbying Capitol Hill, and then getting a lot of this information to the communities, right, to the individuals that we're talking about here today. So yes, we are working on that, and any help that you all that are on the call right now can provide us, that's one of the reasons why we have these webcasts. And I don't know if Luis, you wanted to add anything to that?
I don't know of any specific interventions that are out there. There may be. I haven't followed them, in part because I don't do that much ongoing clinical work. But I think, our instincts as mental health professionals is to help people process their experience. And there are ways that we could elicit that using, of course, patience and working with the family as it is able to deal with this. Some families tell their young children early on of the undocumented status, and others wait till later. And we've heard stories of, they're told when they're 16, when they want to get a driver's license, that they're undocumented or things like that. So it really is a getting them to talk about it, but at their pace, and then helping them find the solutions that work best for them for dealing with the ongoing stress. And I might add, many families will have ideas about safety plans. They don't know how to put them together or how to get in touch with one another, things like that, that we could help walk through how they might do it so that they'll have a plan in place should that awful day come that a parent is arrested.
And I would also add, Joelle, that we have an immigration working group here at the APA, which Wendy is a part of, and it's made up of partly psychologists and partly government relation professionals. And another way might be to sort of interact and meet other psychologists that are working on these issues. There are other people on this call that have written in with comments and questions that are also in the working group. So at the risk of getting 100 emails, which I don't think I will, feel free to email me if you're interested in joining that group as well, and I can tell you about some other groups too. Again, it's SDAV as in Victor, ILA@apa.org. Okay, and this will be our final question because we are over time now. We have been telling mothers and children, okay, sorry. I think we will stop there simply because we are out of time. So thank you all for participating. We really appreciate Wendy and Luis's presentations, and we will be emailing you shortly with a number of follow-ups, including the presentations that a lot of you asked about. And with that, that concludes our webcast. Thank you very much.